Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Doranforth, and Redbridge's Cos Samaras. Each fortnight, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations with leaders, activists, and thinkers from the world of Australian and global politics, culture, and ideas. Willkommen und guten Morgen, liebe Curtinistas. Ihr hört gerade Curtin's Cast mit mir, Nick Doranforth, und meinem guten Campbell Cos Samaras. I've got a smile on Cossy's face. Welcome and good morning, Curtinistas. You are listening to Curtin's Cast with myself, Nick Doranforth, and my great mate, Cos Samaras, director of Redbridge Group. That intro stanza was me speaking in German, not my first tongue, it's actually my father's first language, and that's how you pronounce Doranforth in German. There's some trivia for you all this morning. We've hit double digits. Episode 10 of Curtin's Cast. And today we are doing a megalo election preview with a friend of the JCRC, an Aussie cephalogical superstar. It's such a tongue twister, that word. Why isn't there an easier word for describing the study of polling? Shaun Ratcliff. Shaun Ratcliff is principal of social and political research firm Accent Research. He works on projects for national political campaigns, media outlets, not-for-profit organisations and corporate clients. He's in the business of studying how the public thinks and behaves, what influences their beliefs and actions, and ways to engage them. This is the stuff of electioneering and pollsteering. Welcome, Shaun, to Curtin's Cast.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks for the introduction.
And a formal welcome to Cos. Guys, we are at the pointy end of this campaign. We've got polls coming out left, right and centre. This is our mega election preview. Overnight this morning, news poll came out showing Labor ahead on a 2PP basis, 52-48. Fourth successive week showing that result. Primary votes, 35% for the coalition, steady, 44% for Labor, steady, Greens down 1 to 11%, One Nation up 1 to 8%. We've got 12% for all others, which is steady. Yesterday, we saw your latest Redbridge Accent tracking poll of 20 marginal seats hit newspaper stands, and it showed a number of things, which you're going to deep dive into in a second. Coalition votes stabilising after a number of weeks of falling, but Labor with an election-winning lead on a two-party preferred basis of 54.5%. But as you'll note, the Labor vote is much softer than the coalition's, which is far more locked in behind Peter Dutton. What we're seeing is the polls pointing to a likely minority Labor government, depending on independents. But there's a lot of voters who are undecided, who are wavering. And there is a chance the coalition could claw back enough ground to force Team Elbow to rely on the Greens or perhaps Teals to retain office. So, gentlemen, can you talk us through these polls, and who would you rather be 5 days out from election day? Would you rather be Elbow or Peter Dutton?
Definitely Elbow. There's no doubt about that.
Even if he was losing, still Elbow. But I think Labor certainly looks like the better chance right now of winning the next election.
Yes, well, I note that I was sent through some Sportsbet. Sportsbet are paying $2 for a Labor majority government and $2.50 for minority. So they're favouring a Labor majority over minority, which is kind of the way that I've been sort of shifting over the past few weeks as the campaign's progressed. What do you guys think? Hung Parliament or Labor majority?
I think the best way we can do this is just walk around the country and have a discussion about each seat that's on the table and what's going on in those in those electoral environments, and will the coalition be able to turn things around in a span of 5 days to avoid what I think, and I'm sure Shaun shares my view, is it's a pretty bad result for them on Saturday night.
Well, we can't go through every single seat, Cos, because we'll be here till next Sunday, and I believe
key seats.
You've got I think you've got a busy week ahead of you, including appearing on ABC on Saturday night. But let's look at some of the key seats. Let's start in Victoria, Aston.
Yeah, look, that's a straight up easy gain for Labor. Sorry, for the coalition.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just as a reminder to listeners, Aston was a coalition seat. They lost it at a by-election held after 2022, but you're saying it's going to head back to the Libs. Any other Victorian key seats that we should be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, so it's the usual. So it's Chisholm, it's Bruce, it's McEwen. I noticed that Doug and Kent were out there in Hawke on the weekend with a big party event.
Melton. Yes, you right. That really piqued your interest.
Yeah,
it talks to the big phenomenon of the class realignment, which is happening globally, happening in Australia. You and I, again, wrote about this during the week. You for the Financial Review, myself for the Daily Telegraph, and I made the point that it's looking like a Labor victory, most likely minority, possibly majority, but look at what's happening in those outer suburban working class seats. Look at, are we going to see a replication of what happened at the last Victorian state election? Big almost seismic swings against the Labor Party in what is regarded as traditional base, working class base out in the suburbs.
There's a caveat to that, but I'll let Shaun. Shaun, what do you reckon? I mean, this class realignment, it is occurring, but there's a ton of caveats to all of this, particularly with regards to why young people voting.
Yeah, I mean, so what you're seeing is on income lines and educational lines, obviously, university educated voters have been shifting to the left for decades.
Yeah.
Some of that's a generational shift, though. So younger generations tend to be more likely to enter higher education, get a university degree. So some of the educational cleavage we're seeing open up is actually a generational cleavage. So older generations are much more likely to have not finished high school, much less likely to have a university degree. So some of that is an age factor. Older voters are increasingly conservative, increasingly likely to vote for parties on the right. Younger voters increasingly likely to vote for parties on the left, particularly the Greens. But if we look at some other markers of class like asset ownership, the coalition still do much, much better among asset owners than the parties of the left do. The parties of the left are much more likely to receive the vote of someone who owns few, if any, assets. So, renters, people that don't own shares, people that don't own a business, don't own investment properties. So there's still that class cleavage in terms of asset ownership or wealth.
But it's interesting that you wrote. I wanted to ask you guys about renters. There was a really good article by Peter Mars, who is a housing policy guru who's worked with the JCRC previously. He wrote a really good article for Crikey. Not many good articles appear in Crikey, although things have improved since Guy Rundle got boned last year. Peter said renters are entirely missing from this election, and it's weird. It's weird that they're making up increasing numbers of the Australian population, 30%, and growing. Yet both major parties have had really nothing to say to renters, and it's opening up the space for the Greens, and they're filling this vacuum. Why have they had nothing to say to renters?
So you see in our work, the Gen Z vote for Greens is astronomical. It's the highest I've ever seen it. This is the work that both Shaun and Redbridge have put together.
Yeah.
And it's significant, and the seats that we're tracking, they're not in urban But having said that, perhaps because we know how they're going to vote, right? And yes, there might be some tension between the Labor and the Green camps when it comes to that vote. But really, we're going to see them again express themselves in the coalition versus Till contests. In Wentworth, for example, definitely in
Kooyong, yeah.
Right? So we're going to see them make their voices heard loud and clear. They're going to do that versus Labor versus Green contests. So, I know there's been a bit of talk around Greens not having a good day, but I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I think that the Greens may indeed have a good day based on what we're seeing.
Shifting to another key seat and pursuing our line around class realignment, there was a great long read in Nine Media's Good Weekend magazine lift out over the weekend. One case Samaras was mentioned in dispatches. Really good article by Gay Elkhorn. Gay gave Curtin's caster a little bit of promotion. So thank you, Gay. Thank you if you're listening. Hi. She started off the piece by talking about the seat of Werriwa out in Sydney's west. This used to be Mark Latham territory. Werriwa, how are we looking?
I would be interested in Shaun's view, but I would say Labor will be able to hold onto that seat quite comfortably.
It's looking better now than it was a few months ago. So I think if we were talking last November, I would, or even February this year, I would have said that the coalition had a reasonable shot at Werriwa. It's certainly, I think, longer term.
It's the longer term, though, isn't it? This is the point we're trying to get at. Which is what Cos has been writing about, which I wrote about last week in the Daily Telegraph. I'm having another go in the Fin Review. It's yes, Labor, they will hold these seats, but we're seeing it's the attrition. Okay, it's the attrition. It's the long term, and it brings me to another really good article that I read this morning by Shaun Kelly in The Age. Very critical of Peter Dutton, leaving it too late. He made a good point that Peter Dutton, the ex-copper, you would think his public persona would be centered around discipline and order, but he's actually quite loose. But Shaun actually made another really good point, and I'll quote him directly here. Shaun wrote, "And it should be said that even if Dutton fails, it is still possible that his most significant strategic decision to go after outer suburban seats rather than pursue teal seats turned out to be the coalition's best long-term hope."
Well, I mean, if you come to the state of Victoria and you look at what is going on from a Labor perspective, yeah, sure, they're going to hold on to most of their seats. They're going to lose some potentially, but the margins on all those seats are gone. There's no such. I mean, we have a situation
which means
now
spending more money, which means money, diverting more money and resources. That's the beauty of having, seats
on the Good Weekend podcast, which is, from my perspective, it's good for democracy because those Labor MPs now are going to have to work for their biscuits. And also that political movement is going to have to produce better politicians to hold on to those seats.
Correct.
I think long gone are the days where you just lump someone into a safe seat and, you the people living in that electorate won't ever again hear from them. That's finished.
So speaking about someone who's working hard for their bickies, a friend of ours, Cos, Sam Ray, we spoke about Melton before. Hawke, how's Sam holding up in Hawke?
It's one of those unknowns.
Yeah, known unknowns to channel Donald Rumsfeld.
Primary vote ended up in the mid to high 30s at the last election. The coalition is outspending Labor in YouTube advertising, for example, in Hawke right now. Dutton's camp had obviously that campaign event in Melton on the weekend. Something's going on there.
Yeah, it's getting hard, I think. I think Hawke is certainly, if the coalition were going to win any seats off Labor in Victoria, besides winning back Aston, Hawke would be one of the prime candidates. The swings there do look like they're, based on everything we've done, like they're going to be pretty substantial. It needs a big swing, though, for them to win it. So, yeah, I wouldn't bet money they'll win it, but at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised. It is going to Hawke, McEwen, maybe even Bruce. I mean, it looks like the tide's coming out of it for the Liberal Party. in Victoria now. Like, it was looking pretty substantial in those outer suburban areas a few months ago. Its tide's coming out, so it could quite possibly end up that they win nothing but maybe Aston. But, you know, a few months ago, we were sort of going, it could be 4 or 5 seats in the outer suburbs, plus Chisholm. So Hawke, I think, still is in play, but I'd probably feel less good if I was the Liberal Party now than I did in early February.
Also, it's neighbouring seat of Gorton, right? Again, another one.
Yeah, this is Brendan O'Connor's seat.
Yeah, former, yeah. And that seat is now getting the full bench press from the coalition. And I mean, you know, there's a lot of money being spent there.
All right, let's get them mixing up the metaphors here. Full bench press to eggs. Last night there was the final campaign debate. How much does it matter? The price of a carton of eggs, probably it does matter. Albo seemed to know the price of eggs better than Peter Dutton. I'm not sure what planet Peter Dutton was on, thinking that a carton of eggs costs $4. The last time I rocked into the
super, any eggs for a few years. It's
yeah,
been a while. Did the grocery shop maybe?
Yeah, last time I think I paid $8-9, and there's a shortage at the moment if you can actually find eggs because of the avian bird flu. It's hard to get a hold of.
That was a small independent grocery store, so that might be why I got sort of, you know, cleaned out with my eggs.
Wow, they're your bourgeois shopping habits, Shaun. We'll leave that to you, mate. But that, in a serious point, how seriously, if you're a punter out there in Hawke or McEwen or wherever, and we're gonna dig down into some of the other key seats. You're sitting there, and prospective prime ministers, the prime minister, the potential prime minister, are being asked how much is a carton of eggs. How seriously do you listen to their answers and respond to that sort of question? And the bigger question is, these set piece debates. It seems to me that they're very sort of 80s, 90s thing, and they're not shifting a lot of votes. We go through the motions. That, you know, you have to do them because if you don't do them, if the leaders don't do them, they're seen as sort of squibbing the debate. But, you know, they're not big vote shifting things.
Yeah, they have been not for a very, very long time. You know, the questions around eggs and the price of X, Y, and Z. There was a really good comment made by one person in a focus group we did for the ABC, where she said that most politicians would never have to check their bank balance before walking into a supermarket.
I like that. I like that.
And so it doesn't matter whether you guessed it right or not.
Check the bank balance, mate.
It doesn't matter whether you guessed it right or not. If you guessed it wrong, sure. But if you guessed it right, again, voters will just presume you've done your homework, not that actually something you confront every day. So it's just, you know, debates are great for the baseball fans.
Yeah, I think Australians are smart on all this sort of gotcha shit. Shaun?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't think Seven helped by forcing sort of short answers. I mean, I think the one possible benefit of a debate is it does provide a forum for kind of longer form, you know, responses and follow-up questions, more so than you would get in a normal, press pack when the PM or the opposition leader is getting out of the bus and hopping out of the petrol station to talk about a policy or a local candidate. And, you know, it's a bit more of a controlled environment. There's not a lot of opportunities for follow-up questions and long-form answers. And that's where a debate does provide you with the moderator or moderators with the opportunity to follow up questions.
Yes.
And force the two leaders to really fill out their answers. And if they're being evasive, to pressure them, you know, until they provide an answer. And the sort of 60-second grab responses was a bit cute, I thought. And it takes away the one valuable bit of a debate.
Yeah, and it allows them to fall back on talking points, because they did a lot last night. One thing which also came out of last night was, you know, the culture wars reared their head again. Peter Dutton made some comments on on the Welcome to Country ceremonies. That became a live issue this campaign after we had the Nazi nutbags, neo-Nazi nutbags, decide that it'd be a really good idea to rock up to the Anzac Day dawn service, interrupt the Indigenous speaker who was giving a welcome to country. As far as I'm concerned, Nazis can beep. Dutton weighed in. Again, what do punters think about, the issue generally and what Peter Dutton has to think?
Look, I think it's an issue that most voters don't care about. Again, it's the political class fixating on an issue that really doesn't is not a top of mind issue for most voters.
It was interesting at the AFL actually Anzac Day game later that afternoon. Packed Collingwood versus Essendon match. One of those matches where genuine supporters, particularly Brisbane Lions supporters, hope they both lose, but that's impossible. But the crowd cheered the welcome to country, which was I thought was really interesting.
Most Australians are in the middle and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
It's the fringes that get excited about it, and in this case, the right-wing fringes, and Dutton dancing around with this issue is basically just, again, putting another coat of paint on a painting that Labor has been putting together for him over the last 4 to 5 weeks. And
in that painting, Cozzy, looms large the shadow of Donald Trump. Trump was also Trump was an issue last night. Whether who had his mobile phone number, did he have a mobile phone, and actually it got me thinking, and I was alerted to another story last night, which was the Canadian elections happening happening as well. I think it's happening. Is it happening? I think it's happening Monday, and we're going to get the results Tuesday. And Trump has flipped the election. The governing Liberals were headed for a major defeat, but they're now leading the Conservatives 42.5 to 38.7 in a national vote, which would see a comfortable victory. And this is very much the Trump effect, the reverse Trump Midas effect in play, and it's happening in Australia. So how is that playing out? We're continuing to see the trend of association with Trump is bad news for Peter Dutton.
Just on that, I think this is where I think Shaun can really provide some detail. They've been losing, as in the coalition, to independents, minor parties, and so on. There's this assumption that it's all to conservative right-wing minor parties, but I would say the problems are a lot more broader and deeper, rather than just basically, Peter Dutton's not right-wing enough. What do you reckon, Shaun?
Yeah, so I think the coalition's losing votes all over the place. So some of it is to sort of right-wing minor parties, some of it's to Labor, some of it's even to the Greens. So they're bleeding votes in every direction. I think Trump is a part of that. I see him and his administration as more like background radiation. It's not front of mind for most voters from what we're seeing in all of our research. Voters, when you ask them, like, what's the most important issue to your vote? Not very many are mentioning Donald Trump or tariffs. A few do, but it's a relatively small number. But what we have seen is Donald Trump's approval rating in Australia, which was already pretty bad in February, has dropped every time we've asked.
Well, it's dropping in America too.
Yeah. And so I think it is a bit of a weight around the ankles of the coalition and Peter Dutton. And it's certainly not helped by the fact that before the tariff wars started, Peter Dutton and the coalition were kind of tying themselves to Trump a little bit. They're announcing their own Doge, starting to talk about woke education, sacking public servants. It didn't help. They sort of created that comparison themselves, and then they've tried to walk it back a little bit. So I don't think that helps. And it also, obviously, there's an element perhaps of a little bit of a rally around the flag, which we're certainly seeing in Canada. I think that's a much bigger effect in Canada. Where,
the Trump bump.
Yeah. Where Donald Trump, directly attacked the country. It was singled out with tariffs very early on. This talk of Canada becoming the 51st state. So I think it's much more salient there, where they share a border with the US and they've been singled out. Here, I don't think as many voters are necessarily taking Trump directly into account or thinking of Peter Dutton as Temu Trump, as some people have started calling him. But I think the instability created, the uncertainty created, as well as the comparison that Dutton himself created, has been a minor part of, combined with other factors, I think a minor part of what we've seen in the slide in the coalition votes since February.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, guys, correct me if you think I'm wrong or mistaken, kind of reminds me of the 2001 election. This time it's working against the coalition. So with Tampa asylum seeker crisis, and we had this, number of unauthorized boat arrivals, and then compounded by the 9/11 terrorist attacks, there was this climate of uncertainty and fear, which played into incumbents, the incumbent being John Howard, Kim Beazley and Labor side. It worked against them. But, people have often misread the 2001 election. That was important, but the Liberals had been on that actually lost the Aston by, that they'd done really badly at the Aston by-election. After that, the coalition recovery across 2001 had actually been a longer-term trend. That had been out there, frankly, pork barreling, marginal seats, and then on top of that, you had the uncertainty, the climate of fear, with terrorism, joining up with the rancorous debate around asylum seekers and the Tampa. And it seems to me there are echoes of that, but this time it's actually working in Labor's favour with that the uncertainty and the economic uncertainty around Trump.
Well, you had a pandemic, you had an inflationary crisis, and you now got a potential economic period of instability that is obviously triggered by Trump's behaviour with regards to tariffs. So when we speak to voters now, their response in this space is, I've just endured this, or my family's just endured these two events, and now I don't know what the future's got in front of us. And I don't like Dutton because there's too much of a risk about him. So that risk campaign, that narrative that Labor has been trying to set up and paint Dutton with, he kind of like walked into it.
He did, didn't he?
Yeah.
So he in that environment, you've got a country that's basically experienced two massive, significant economic events, being the pandemic and the inflationary crisis. Your solution to that should never have been the policy of pain, which was sacking people, forcing people back to the office, punitive measures around immigration. And although they think this works for them, there's always victims to a policy, right? And so when diverse communities hear the coalition talk about immigration, their response is, that's your first step, because when you get in, you'll get even more hard line. So everything they've done has been about reducing their electoral coalition down to their core base. Instead of expanding their pie, they've been actually in the business of cutting it down.
Yeah,
Shaun.
I was going to say, just sort of piggybacking on what you were saying. What I find fascinating is the rating that voters that rate the economy as one of the three most important issues to their vote. Their rating of the performance of the Liberal Party has tanked across the 5 waves of our key seat track. So in wave 1, they were in net positive territory. So they had a net positive rating of 6%, while the Labor Party had a net negative rating of 38%. Over that time, the Labor Party's improved a little bit. So these are just voters that say the economy, economic management is one of their top 3 issues. So the Labor Party's improved a little bit. They're not great still, but they went from net negative 38 to net negative 30. But in that same time, so improved by 8 points. But in that same time, the coalition dropped by 25 points from net positive 6% to net negative 19%.
It's a dramatic fall, isn't it? And you also, the coalition primary vote, according to the latest track, the average of your 5 tracks, it's dropped 5% since the last election. The Labor's only up 1%, 5%. That's a big number.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's in key battleground seats.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And in our track, it's actually dropped down by 9 since we first started the first wave, or give or take.
No, that's just so.
In Victoria, it's 11.
Incumbents do normally claw back ground during a campaign, and even when they lose in 2007, I think Howard did claw back a little. Labor clawed back a little in 2013. We've talked about the 2022 election. It wasn't that the Libs did really badly. It's the worst result for them since the modern Liberal Party was formed in 1944. But they did, I think they clawed back ground as well. But this is beyond that. That typical incumbents clawing back some ground. This has been a really bad campaign, and I'm actually, in terms, speaking from a Labor perspective, one of the things which annoys me sometimes about Labor true believers is when campaigns go badly, singling out individual is illogical because politics is a team sport. This Liberal campaign is beyond Peter Dutton, so
of course
it's more of a systemic issue because you're talking about those, the public sector cuts, the work from home brouhaha, whether it's Peter Dutton misspeaking, not being so good under pressure on the spot, but this is the bigger thing. How does this campaign apparatus run by professionals? This is their job. They got one job. How did they make such seismic errors?
Well, they're not actually really good at it, to be frank. I mean, come on. I mean, we could talk for hours about just all the mistakes they have made.
Oh, let's do it.
Right, and it's they've gone from a situation, as we commented, around in the position of potentially winning this thing to now, basically facing an existential crisis on their hands. And it won't be that bad, but it's going to be pretty bad, right? And Labor has not clawed back territory. As we touched on in previous episodes, they've brought back some of their base, some of the people they've lost over the last 18 months. But what really is happening is the coalition's basically, as I touched on before, they've completely annihilated their coalition down to their core base now. They went out of their way to completely piss off large chunks of their constituency because they have this caricature about who their constituency is. Right, and they think their constituency is that sort of person who's going to get their rocks off on seeing public servants being sacked, or they're going to get their rocks off on Peter Dutton saying that the ABC and the Guardian are the hate media. Right, I mean, this is just bizarro stuff.
Well, they've made themselves the issue. They've made themselves the issue, and the old motto is oppositions don't win elections, governments lose elections. And they've seemed to have, they've not just thrown the playbook out, they've decided to sort of light it up, douse it with kerosene, light it up whilst they're still holding the playbook.
Well,
I'm shaking my head.
Well, they're not just down to their base. They've actually, it looks like, lost part of their base. So, those inner suburban and middle suburban seats that they lost in 22 were part of their base. Right. So we're talking. You mentioned earlier about Shaun Kelly and talking about is the outer suburban and regional strategy a good one? Well, one of the problems is they've decided to definitively abandon part of their base. So as I mentioned the other day when Cos and I were at the press club, they lost in 22. They lost the seats of 2 former prime ministers. 3 former Liberal prime ministers.
And a potential future prime minister in Josh Frydenberg.
They lost Peter Costello's seat. They lost Malcolm Turnbull's seat. They lost Menzies' seat that obviously Josh Frydenberg held. And the election before that, 19, they'd lost Tony Abbott's seat. All right, so they've lost. That's a big. You'd argue those seats are part of their base. It's where the Liberal Party was formed. It's where most of its leadership used to come from. And then they lost Joe Hockey's seat too, right? Like a lot of the recent Liberal Party leadership. In fact, I don't think there's a single Liberal Prime Minister since the 1970s, besides Scott Morrison, whose seat the Liberal Party still holds. Right?
That's when you put it in those
crazy.
terms, it's staggering. It's
That's
staggering.
right. And so if if I was the Liberal Party leader right now, I would probably want to win some of those seats back. Now, obviously, you can go hunting for new seats, but parties are always changing, and political geography is always changing, right? It's not static. But I'm not sure I would have gone, I don't care about the seat of Menzies. I don't care about the seat of Howard. I don't care about the seat of Costa, which now abolished, but under Dutton's current policy, they wouldn't be chasing Higgins, right? Under his strategy. I don't think I would have given up on these seats so easily. Like, you're not going to win them all back, but I think sort of going, that don't matter, I'm going to win Werriwa, I'm going to win McEwen. Like, the electoral maths is quite difficult.
It gets harder and harder. You know, it's a bit,
Also,
thinking about that's some terrific insights, Shaun. Thank you. It reminds me of Oscar Wilde's quote, you know, to riff on that, to lose one of these heartland blue ribbon seats may be regarded as a misfortune. To lose all of them looks like craziness.
Yeah, well, if you
carelessness,
think
craziness.
In 2013 when they won office, like Tony Abbott, Julie Bishop, Joe Hockey, Malcolm Turnbull, like some of the senior players in the party at that time, all their seats are gone.
Yeah,
they don't hold a single one of those seats.
And the outer suburban strategy is not a strategy, right? It's
an aspiration. It's an aspiration because
it's aspiration. It doesn't seem to be like they have a strategy with regards to the outer suburbs. So, and I'll tell you why. So the main number of seats that are in the outer suburbs of our large cities that are in play potentially, if they had a strategy, would be in Sydney and Melbourne. What's the thing about outer suburban Melbourne and Sydney? It's diverse. Incredibly.
Yes. Because can I interrupt your I'm going to very quickly interrupt your train of thought. I saw a Liberal ad last night, and in one sense, you know, it seemed to be effective, striking. It had a family sitting around the kitchen table, and it was but they were, you know, stereotypically sort of Anglos. You had a guy in sort of high vis tradie. Yeah, I think the wife and the mum, she looked like a nurse. She was a nurse, 2 kids, and I looked at that and I thought, yeah, it's effective. And they were talking about, you know, grocery bills going up, energy prices going out, lights going off. Don't let, like, you can't give Labor another 3 years. But then I actually thought, after I saw the ad, I thought, this stereotype they've got of outer suburbs in Melbourne and Sydney doesn't look like actual on the ground. It's like we're actually talking about an Indian Australian family, Chinese Australian family. They've got this. They're playing to the stereotype. And I think it comes back to Shaun's point: is they're falling back and trying to relock in that base. What they're pitching to, what they've got in their minds, or the advertising agencies have got in their mind, is an stereotypical image of outer suburban Australia, which bears no relation to modern 21st century Australia.
I queued up to vote on Saturday, and it took me an hour and 45 minutes. That was how long the queue was.
Wow!
In the early voting centre that serviced both McEwen and Call in Craigieburn.
Did you get a democracy sausage?
No, mate. No, it was in a shopping centre, and so the queue was long. But the one thing that struck me about that queue, the volunteers were whiter, especially from the Liberal Party. Right, it was incredibly diverse queue of people from all walks of life, and that is the outer suburbs of Melbourne. Now, it doesn't mean Labor does well with them, but I would say that the coalition has this, as we touched on before, caricature of who lives out there in these electorates. So Werriwa is a good example of this. And Werriwa is in a diverse electorate. Now, I would be very careful with my language with regards to student visas, holiday working visas, caps on immigration. Look, if I had that policy, I'd probably park it, put it in the suitcase until the election was done, then do it. I wouldn't be putting it in the mix right now because, you see, You've got that coupled with, the coalition's earlier announced policy around dual citizenships. For example, if you were committed a criminal offence, you get deported. What diverse Australians have told us is, that's just the first line. Where would he stop? Because, of course, they forget that most of these Australians who come from diverse communities and come from other parts of the world, they kind of have seen this happen before. They've seen this story.
I've seen the movie play out.
The movie played out before, right?
I think the distributing the citizenship and the deportation of dual citizens is a much bigger, if it had got the airplay, it'd be a much bigger problem, I think, than, maybe saying we're going to reduce the migration rate a little bit. The second one does have a lot of support amongst voters, including
Yes.
those that are first or second or third generation migrants. But yeah, saying, okay, if you're Australian Greek or Australian Italian or Australian Chinese and you have dual citizenship, we can strip your Australian citizenship, even if you've grown up here, even if you've never lived in that other country. We can strip you of your citizenship and deport you. That to me is potentially far more serious. That's saying it doesn't matter how long you've lived in this country. It doesn't matter whether you actually ever lived in the country that you've got your citizenship with. We're going to treat you like second-class citizens.
That's the one that's been brought up the most.
Yeah, and not only do they want to be able to strip, it's without a judge, right? So you can already do that. You can. There are mechanisms where that can be done, but it requires going through a court. It requires a pretty high burden of proof. What the coalition was talking about wasn't just being able to strip dual citizens of their Australian citizenship. It was the minister having the discretion to do it without taking it through the courts, which to me is, that's a huge degree of discretionary power that could quite easily be misused.
Yeah, and it comes back to the point that we've been hammering this morning, that the image of who is the typical Australian living in these outer suburban seats is misplaced. I was actually another thing I've been watching this week, which sort of encapsulates some of the campaign coverage for me, was there was a brouhaha in the seat of Kooyong outside the pre-poll with covered by Sky News, and Monique Ryan was jousting with Sky News anchor and reporter Laura Jays, and I thought to myself, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, and the press gallery is reporting from a different galaxy altogether. It's just so. This is do they actually think that people out there in the burbs could give a rat's about whether Monique Ryan is taking questions from Laura Jays? Nothing against either of them, but it just seems to be totally detached from people's lived experience. And I do want to get back to our key seats, but I want to get this over with. Despite those caveats, I want to quickly dig into a couple of the Victorian seats, talking about those inner city middle suburbs. So we might as well get to Kooyong. Monique Ryan, will she hold?
26,000 new enrollees since the last election.
That's a lot.
Median age is under the age of 40. Thousands would have left the electorate. Unfortunately, probably thousands would have died.
That's life, guys.
Right? That's life, right? And if we look at those who have left it or have passed away, median age will be much older. I'd say that just on paper, on demography alone, she would be in better place now than she would have been in 2022. That coupled with the campaign.
And hasn't been helped by Liberal campaign, Amelia Hamer, the great renter with an investment property.
Yeah, look, and that's
two investment properties in a trust fund.
That's right, correct. And that again, that's
Where do they get these people from?
Yeah. So will she hold? I think she should. But these are really, really complex electorates where the independents rely on a very interesting coalition of voters. The Till vote is made up of former Labor and Green voters, disaffected Liberal voters, some who normally vote independents, and that coalition needs to stick. And even more importantly, those 26,000 weren't there last time.
Yeah, but this is the way of the future. This is the way of the future. The other teal seat that we've been monitoring closely in Melbourne's inner southeast is Goldstein, held by Zoe Daniels, former ABC anchor, up against Tim Wilson, who was deposed in the 2022 election. How's Goldstein looking? Seems to be that if we're going to, people are talking about if there's one teal seat to fall, it would be that one. What do we think?
Well, I think Curtin would go before Goldstein.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, Cheney.
Yeah. Just based on everything I'm saying, I think Curtin would be the most vulnerable to the coalition winning it back. I don't think that's necessarily likely, but it's probably the demographically, politically, the sort of electorate that the coalition in its current form would probably be able to win back most easily. But I'm not sure that's particularly likely. Goldstein, I don't see why Zoe Daniels would lose. It doesn't seem likely. Don't know if Tim Wilson is a pro or con for the Liberal Party.
Yeah, he's a bit of he can be a divisive character. I've known Tim.
Yeah,
since
he's got name recognition.
I've known Tim since university days.
Yeah.
Is it Goldstein or Goldstein, guys?
Goldstein.
I heard you say Goldstein.
Pretty sure. Cos?
Goldstein, but I come from Broadmeadows, mate, so no point asking me about how to pronounce the language.
We're gonna have to get an official ruling from the AEC. It's one of those perennial questions. Goldstein. What do you think, Curtinistas? We might take a poll. Make Curtin's Cast a little bit more interactive. Back to the burbs, guys, and let's get out of Victoria, New South Wales, unless there's any New South Wales seats that, apart from wherever, which you think we should be looking at. What about Gilmore, actually? What about Gilmore?
Oh, yeah, you got Gilmore, Patterson, Robertson, all those electorates along the, regional, within regional New South Wales. Yeah, definitely Gilmore, I think, should be a coalition gain. And if you look at where they should do better, and also where their theory, which they're currently putting around the media, is that their theory of getting really strong preference flows from One Nation should apply, would be in regional Australia. So regional New South Wales, regional Queensland. That's what I would expect the flow from One Nation to be stronger than it would be in urban settings, right? And so, I am sometimes a bit too cruel to their strategy, because I call it as, another wonder weapon, theory where they just rely on these Hail Marys to pull off a miracle. But in this case, that strategy should work in regional New South Wales and regional Queensland.
Regional Australia, actually, we haven't really talked about the Nationals much. How are the Nationals tracking? Same, but different?
I don't think there's any national.
They're just flying under the radar.
I can't think of any National Party seats likely to change hands.
Yeah, there is that contest in Bullwinkle, which the Libs and the Nats are contesting. You have them in the mix in Richmond, I think. Oh, and they are contesting in a very big way the federal seat of Bendigo in Victoria.
Yes, I saw that pop up in news coverage over the last week.
So
this is just at a state level. This is Jacinta Allen's seat.
Well, her part of her seat falls into that, yeah. But Lisa Chesney, the current Labor incumbent, works the electorate pretty hard. So, and it is an electorate that has demographically changed from the times when this seat was a much more advantageous, option for the coalition 20 odd years ago, right?
So probably status quo for the Nats, broadly speaking, across the board, which also means if it is a status quo result,
there is that contest there, and
they maintain their outsized influence, particularly in Queensland, on the coalition party room. That's what a lot of commentators and politicos miss, is the outside influence that the Nats have on the coalition party room, which is leading to problems in the teal seats and the former heartland seats, which Shaun identified earlier, and also perhaps some of the problems with the pitch to suburban voters.
Well, and also the Liberal Party leadership has become increasingly, suburban fringe, rural. So if you think in the Liberal Party, so Peter Dutton is kind of a fringe suburban seat in Brisbane. Dixon is out mostly on the edge of Brisbane. Angus Taylor is rural New South Wales, and Susan Ley is rural New South Wales. So the Liberal Party leadership itself is quite regional. Or with Peter Dutton being the least regional of the Liberal leadership, and he lives on a farm. So
They would say that makes them salt of the earth, Aussie type. Shaun, are you disputing that?
Well, I would point out that about 2/3 of Australian voters live in cities.
Mate, we've always been one of the myths of Australia. I should say to listeners, myths aren't falsehoods, but myths are things which have some element in historical reality, but are enlarged to become myths. One of the myths about Australia is that we were this kind of rural utopia and have become more urbanised, more metropolitan. Australia, almost from the get-go, and really from the mid of the 19th century, is one of the most urbanised countries on the face of this planet. We always have been.
80% of Victoria's population is in Melbourne, over 80% of Western Australia's population is in Perth, around 65% to 70% of New South Wales population is in Sydney.
And a lot of the rest is in Newcastle and Wollongong.
That's right, correct.
Yeah.
And so that's still very much urbanised.
Yeah.
The only state where this does not apply is in Queensland, where 55% of Queensland's population is out of Brisbane. And so again, if you're becoming really good at winning electorates which are not in big cities of Australia, long term you're going to have a big bloody problem on your hands.
Yep. The key's always been to win the battlers in the bush, but most importantly, the city. Cos, you mentioned Western Australia there before, and I wanted to shift over the Nullarbor, over the other side of the continent. Bullwinkle is a seat we've mentioned in dispatches. How is that looking? Liberal gain?
It should be a gain, and we've got this federal seat of Pearce, and Tagney as well. Tagney,
you're saying should, but at the start of the campaign,
yes.
Correct me if I'm verbaling you here, but you're pretty much putting it down automatically as a Lib gain. Now you're saying should.
Should, because I have little confidence that they had a strategy to win these seats at all. Right. And so, one can only say that at the beginning of the campaign, if they had run a decent campaign, they would have been winning these seats. No problems. Now I put a should or may next to it because it's just been appalling.
The other thing about Western Australia, they might be saying we should have done this, is they should have given a more prominent role to the Shadow Defence Minister, Andrew Hastie. He has been a glaring absence. And I wouldn't mind asking you, why is that so? Why has he been absent? One theory that I have is when you look at the kind of leadership jockeying, perhaps Peter Dutton is thinking, don't want to put him up in lights.
Yeah, look, I mean, he's the one individual that looks really relaxed in front of a camera, does not answer questions off a script. He's the sort of person that probably could relate to out of suburban Australia. Fairly moderate in his views.
Yeah, they've been painted as extreme this week. I watched I like most Australians, I don't look at the miniature of every single thing which happens in the campaign, but there was a blow up on X, formerly known as Twitter. How long do you reckon we'll continue to say X, formerly known as Twitter?
I just still call it Twitter.
Yeah,
I refuse to acknowledge the new name.
There was a blow up about Andrew Hastie and what he'd previously said about women serving in frontline combat defence roles in the ADF. I don't think it was that controversial, to be honest. And the media pursued him at a press conference when they'd left this sort of defence policy quite late. I actually thought Hastie dealt with the media quite well.
He's a very good
sounded quite reasonable.
Yeah, he's very good in interviews. He's quite smart, clearly. I think the other.
So why has he been hidden? Why has he been hidden, guys?
So one is your theory, Nick. Another theory.
It's this conspiratorial theory.
Look at his two-party preferred margin post redistribution.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
He's got a 1%. He's got a 1% margin. So it may be that he is treating his seat like the marginal seat it is. after the state election, where the Liberal Party probably didn't recover as much ground as they'd hoped they would, I wonder if some Liberals in WA are a little bit concerned that
That's right.
a seat with a 1% margin isn't safe, and they can't. You would probably expect a little bit of a swing back in WA, but a lot of the polling isn't suggesting that's the case. So I suspect Andrew Hastie's treating Canning like it's a marginal seat, and he's not leading the electorate very often.
That's what's going on. I think he's just preoccupied in trying to basically make sure he's not one of those casualties on the night.
Yes. So
I don't think he will be, but it's understandable he might be doing everything he can to make those sandbags margin. Yeah.
Okay, so it's not like the Pet Shop Boys sang, "Go west, life is peaceful there." We're going to swing back east. Did you like that segue? We're going to swing back east. Anything of note in South Australia, the land of the crow eaters?
Sturt.
Yeah.
Sturt, federal seat of Sturt. So it's definitely one of those smokies where you wouldn't at the beginning of the campaign think it would be in play. I would say that, even the MRP that Shaun and us put together, it does indicate that it could potentially be in play. It's got a very significant number of Commonwealth public servants in it. And so that's definitely going to be a factor.
And it's also the kind of seat that Dutton kind of gave up on when he decided, or I shouldn't.
This was Christopher Pyne's seat, former Defence Minister Christopher Pyne.
Established, suburban to middle suburban, middle class to upper middle class, well-educated electorate. And so when the coalition leadership or the Liberal Party leadership decided on its outer suburban and regional strategy, they kind of turned their back on seats like Sturt. And what's important to note is this is the only seat left in Greater Adelaide that the Liberal Party hold. Really? If they lose this seat, they have no seats in Adelaide.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So, I wouldn't call Sturt right now, but I wouldn't be surprised if they lost it either.
Heading south, Tassie, Lions. Lions makes up, I think it's over half of the actual, half of the state of Tasmania is captured by Lions. How's Lions looking?
It is Tasmania, right? And so...
Say no more, guys. Say no more.
Well, it's central northern Tasmania for Labor is really, really tough territory. Yeah. And on paper, based on the way the campaign's going, Rebecca White should comfortably win that seat for Labor. No, I wouldn't say comfortably, but win it. But there's always a but when it comes to Tassie and when it comes to the Labor brand, because it is struggling. And outside of Hobart, it's really tough for them these days.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And one of the things, so Tassie is the kind of spiritual heart of the Greens party. How are the Greens tracking? And conversely, we're picking on the Libs, the coalition, a great deal today because, well, quite frankly, they deserve it after this campaign. And I made the observation earlier that governments lose elections, oppositions don't win them, and the Libs have made themselves the issue on too many occasions. And there's another policy which has sort of flown off the radar, which is nuclear, which is this big bang policy which is announced. It didn't land as badly as I guess many sort of lefties would have thought, because I think the debate has moved on. But it hasn't been spoken about in the campaign trail at all. Why is that?
The Labor camp has been running ads online, but I know they've been running it effectively everywhere, which is the $600 billion required to build these reactors will be basically acquired via cuts. So they have been ruthlessly running a narrative that Peter Dutton will find the money to pay for this by cutting services. And of course, the coalition has gladly helped the Labor campaign by announcing policies that were all about allowing an area to be built around cuts. So it's, I suspect that's the reason it's becoming quite a difficult policy area for them to win any votes off.
Yeah, I think like a lot of the coalition's policies the last few months, the nuclear policy was quite half-baked. if they had announced the nuclear policy as part of a broader energy policy, like so their gas reserve policy, for instance, if they had announced that along with the nuclear policy and they'd said, we're going to invest in renewables because we're a responsible party of government, and we're going to reserve gas for the domestic market to make sure that we've got a reliable power supply and an affordable power supply, keep power prices cheap for manufacturing and other businesses, as well as households. And then in the long term, we're going to invest in nuclear so that once we get to that point where we're sort of 80% renewables, we've got this reliable source of low carbon energy. That would have sounded like a sensible policy. And even if you said, okay, nuclear is really expensive, they would have said, yeah, but that's the price of having a stable grid that combined with storage and hydro and gas as well as renewables ensures that Australia has a reliable and affordable energy source well into the 2050s or beyond.
By the way, the gas...
We build these nuclear power plants in an unrealistic time frame and we have no other policy. And it's like, what happens while we're waiting for the nuclear power plants to be built? What happens if they take a lot more than the optimistic 12 years you anticipated? Like, it wasn't a serious policy. And then they kind of forgot about it because they realized, well, I don't know why they forgot about it, but they just sort of dropped it. It's like it was a radioactive hot potato.
Yeah, but by the way, the gas reservation policy is a fraud. It's a con. It actually, I've gone out and asked the experts. It reserves about 1% of the available gas that can be reserved. The surplus gas, it reserves about 1%. It's not a gas reservation policy, but interestingly, and this is another smooth segue, the nuclear policy played out quite well in Queensland initially. And again, talking to people that I know, particularly talking to my comrades in the Australian Workers' Union, they said the nuclear actually was playing out quite well, and particularly in regional Queensland, where people have sort of moved on from the stereotypes around Chernobyl, the Fukushima disaster, and actually associated building a nuclear industry with jobs and hope for regional Australia. So anyway, I want to talk about Queensland, but
yeah, Labor has spent over $88,000 on YouTube alone in the federal seat of Bondi. Something's going on.
Yes,
in southeastern Queensland.
So let's dig deep into Queensland. Let's talk about the 3 L's, and you might have some other suggestions. I want to talk about Logan, the seat held by Treasurer Jim Chalmers, and Leichhardt.
I don't think Logan's in the equation. I think that would be fine. That's not a problem.
Because Longman's one of these 20 seat. Longman's part of the track. Is that right or not?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's right.
Both Longman and Leichhardt are part of
You might want to explain these seats, because Queensland's a kind of a different universe for us.
Yeah.
Me at least.
Leichhardt is one of these
in the city, Melbourne.
Yeah, Leichhardt's one of these seats which, for those who are not aware of the geography, think of Cairns, right? It's one of the
far north Queensland.
Yeah, far north Queensland.
Sugar country.
Crocodiles.
But
big Indigenous population too.
So Dutton was up there during the weekend. Clearly something again is bubbling on up there. Labor's been talking it up, but I haven't seen any really significant investment into it. So it's one of these sets we'll be watching election night. It may fall Labor's way if they have a really great night. But it is Queensland's again, really difficult political territory.
How One Nation and the trumpet of patriots faring?
This is where One Nation's preferences to the coalition will perform a lot better, and they have historically anyway in Queensland. And this is where I think that if the coalition has lost votes to minor parties, primarily to One Nation, they will perform better in getting some of the preference flow there versus. So normally it's 65% of the vote from One Nation goes to the coalition. It's over 70% in the state of Queensland. So look, I still will put my money on the coalition or the LNP when we're talking about Queensland, holding on to Leichhardt. But I'm interested in southeastern Queensland because that's where I think we might see some upsets.
How are those sort of, whatever you want to call them, micro right parties, populist right parties, flirting with far right politics, One Nation, and the Trumpet of Patriots. By the way, guys, did you get the text message from the Trumpet of Patriots on Saturday? I did. A number of my friends did. You didn't get them?
No.
I feel special now. How are those two? How are One Nation and the Trumpet of Patriots? How are they faring nationally? And I guess most importantly, how are they faring in Queensland? So they pushed those SMS out. The online and traditional media advertising has ramped up.
One Nation look like they're tracking pretty well. I wouldn't be surprised if nationally they get like 7 or 8% of the first preference vote, which will obviously be geographically constrained in certain areas. So we mentioned Hunter before. They've traditionally done quite well our last few elections in Hunter. So, Hunter could be a One Nation Labor 2-candidate preferred contest.
That's right.
And in Queensland, obviously, certain parts of Queensland, they do really well. Basically, a belt from sort of just outside Brisbane down into New South Wales is sort of called One Nation territory these days.
Yeah, that's right. And I think their position's a little bit inflated in public polls, a little bit. I think some pollsters have put them at like 10%. I think it's a bit too high, to be frank.
Really? Because the one of the theses which does the rounds is it's to borrow a phrase from the UK, is the phenomenon of shy Tories, and actually is the shy One Nation voter a thing?
No,
it's not.
No,
not in polling. No.
What about the shy Trumpet of Patriots?
No,
we don't know yet because this is their first election.
That's not correct. But
I don't.
No. Look, it's we don't. I mean, this shy concept is just bollocks, really. But that's a separate issue. I think.
Oh, it's a live issue now. Cause explain why don't you explain to listeners why you think that the shy Tory is a crock? Because people would say, and actually, people would point to the last US presidential election and say
Australia's a very different country.
Yeah, well, we've got compulsory voting. That's the big thing. That's the
compulsory voting, where our Conservative Party is not viewed as a far right political option. But having said that, one thing we do find with regards to, let's go to the US and talk about Trump. Trump voters are not really shy about voting Trump, right? I mean, this notion that it's a very left wing, inner urban mindset to think that voters out there feel the shame voting for a political party which they don't agree with, as in progressives don't agree with, right? It's just absolute bollocks.
Tell us what you really think, Cos Samaras. Now we've been.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not to say that some of the opinion polls might not be underestimating the right wing vote. It's possible,
right.
But I don't think
it's a methodology rather than
it could be a sampling issue. It could be something else. I don't think it's because voters are ashamed of admitting that they're going to vote for One Nation or Trumpet of Patriots or the coalition.
Yeah, but another way of expressing in Australia and taking into consideration Australian exceptionalism is the voice. So I don't think you had people out there sort of waving banners, saying, we're voting against the voice. It was more of a quiet reserve thing, and the anti-voice vote got enormous momentum as the campaign before the campaign proper and during the campaign. So I think perhaps in that respect, whether it's shy Tory is the right or wrong phrase, that might sort of draw out the analogy, but it also reminds us.
Shaun has a really good. Sorry, Nick. Shaun has a really good sequence in detailing what happened with the referendum. Shaun, if you can capture it in a couple of minutes, I think the listeners will be well informed.
Yeah, well, I mean, so one point to make is that the polling pretty much nailed the voice at the end. Not everyone got it right, but in aggregate, polling did pretty well. It was very clear it was going to lose a couple of months, including Redbridge polling, a couple of months before the vote. But obviously, late 22, early 23, yes was well ahead, 60, 65%. But the issue with that support was it was very soft. So when we were looking at support for the voice in late 22, early 23, so 6 months or more, well over 6 months before the actual referendum was held, yes was well ahead, but a lot of that was soft. So, and when people were saying 60, 65% of voters were voting yes, that was with undecideds removed. So in late 22, when we were polling about the voice, 20% of voters were undecided. So when people were saying, 60 or 65% of voters support it, that was removing the 20% that were undecided. If they were added in, so if you said yes, undecided, no, yes was closer to 50%.
That's right.
Even at its height. So only about 50, at its height, only about half of voters were saying they were going to vote for the voice. 20% were undecided, approximately, and about 30 said no. But of that 50% that said they were voting for the voice, about half of that, or nearly half of that, was soft. So the sort of solid vote for yes was never really much above 30%. So basically what happened was, over the course of the referendum and the period leading up to it, most of those undecided voters became no voters. A lot of the soft yes voters became no voters. And so what you ended up with when you got to the referendum and about 39% voted yes was you're basically down to the solid yeses plus a few others.
Yeah. Do you know, it reminds me another, pouring cold water on some lefty shibboleths is, it's a terrible mixed metaphor, but anyway, same-sex marriage, a lot of people misread the same-sex marriage plebiscite. So the headline figure is 66% yes. It was roughly 66%, but that was non-compulsory voting. I can tell you that had people been forced to vote, it would have been much closer to 50-50, much closer to 50-50. Now, I also raised the voice. We spent a lot of this pod talking about the coalition's foibles, but I actually think it's worth saying, it's worth pointing out that the Labor campaign machine has worked well. It's been a well-oiled machine. And I have to say, Albo has campaigned well. He has campaigned well. I think this is his best campaign. It's certainly better than The Voice, though. That's coming up. It's a pretty low base. That was not a great performance. To be honest, 2022 election was not a great campaign. He's been better for that, and actually, it's led me to. I want to test an interesting hypothesis on you. The defeat of The Voice in late 2022 was a good thing for Labor. It didn't feel like it at the time, and it's not a good result for Indigenous First Nations, Indigenous Australians. But in retrospect, it may well be seen to be a good thing for Labor. It meant it was a reminder that they had to focus on material issues. They had to focus on the economy, and the fact that it got that defeat out of the way. There was a lot of pain that Labor. There was a lot of pain that Labor experienced out of the Voice result, but long term, it was a wake up call, and it took a long time. They kept putting, it was like the snooze. The alarm went off, and they kept putting the snooze on, but they eventually woke up.
Yeah, when the election was about to hit them.
Yeah.
I think people took the right lessons out of it, but it took a while.
Very belated, mate. Like I said,
there was February,
the
March.
mobile phone alarms going off is like it's snooze.
Correct. So
he hasn't been Captain Snooze this election.
Let's not get carried away.
It's been a good campaign.
Labor will end up with a low primary vote. It will end up with in a number of electorates where it loses more skin. It will win this election purely because of a well-organised machine that Labor is really well adapted at putting together and has historically done so. And that's with Paul Erickson, who's the campaign director. it's also going to pull off this result because it's had an opponent who has run a campaign akin to someone who's blind drunk at 3 a.m. in the morning.
Okay, you mentioned Paul Erickson, Labor's National Secretary, experienced Party Supremo. He has run a good campaign. Cos, tell listeners what it's like. You've been there. What's the final week like as a campaign director? What's the pressure like? What are the known unknowns? How's it dealing with candidates? It must be like herding cats. You've got Marvin there in the background. I want to see Marvin make an appearance on the pod one day. I demand to see Marvin. What would your advice be to? You don't really need to give Paul Erickson advice, but what's the campaign like? What would you do in this final week if you were running the show?
Well, basically, the final week of the campaign, from a campaign official's perspective, is what you've done, you've done. So the train is now on the tracks. It's heading to the station. And, there's all this talk about the coalition, for example, going to, pull out some Hail Marys this week and so on. Well, most of it's done. I actually, when I did 4 state elections in Victoria and I think 5 federal and 11 by-elections, the last week of every one of those campaigns was the most relaxed for me because everything that you could do, you've already done. The real stressful period is trying to get the strategic settings right. So then when you roll out that machine, it's working. Because if you get that, if the initial work you do is wrong, you lose. Flat out, you can't change midstream. This is where the coalitions really messed it up because they clearly had not done the work. The machine clearly was not fit for match fit, and they were found wanting. And now they're trying to fix it in the middle of a campaign. It's too late, right? You're dealing with an electorate that doesn't want to hear from you. You're dealing with an electorate that is hard to reach at the best of times. So last week,
who have voted, Cos? What are we up to now in terms of pre-polling?
Yes, correct.
Was it 700,000 in the first few days?
That's right. So last week is logistics, making sure those ads keep running. It's managing any hotspots that may be created by whether there's a problem at a local campaign level. If there's a leaders debate, you've got to manage the leader. But look, most of it's done.
And we are done. We are out of time on this megalo edition of Curtin's Cast. Shaun, thank you very much for joining us. And I'm sure we're going to see you on the podcast in future editions. Shaun, Cos, good luck. The final week of this campaign, good luck on election day, on election night, as you digest and interpret the numbers for Australians. And thank you, Curtinistas, Dankeschön. Thank you for listening. Please refer a mate on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple. But until next week, when we review the 2025 federal election, it is goodbye. Tschüss.